Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gina Priotassa. I'm VP here at Kite, a PR and events agency specializing in the media and advertising industry. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have everyone here and opening up our Women in Media meetup, which is usually held in New York, to a wider audience. We have participants all across the US and hopefully some attendees from even other parts of the world. We'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsor, AdColony. AdColony is the highest quality mobile advertising and marketing platform. Check them out at adcolony.com. I wanted to welcome our panelists today. We have Amanda Martin joining from Goodway Group, Gabriella Aversa from AdColony, and Lauren Fisher from Advertiser Perceptions. Leading our conversation is Nicole Perrin from eMarketer. We will be talking about the impacts from COVID on the digital advertising industry, also talking about consumer behavior and how that's changed during the pandemic, as well as the early signs that we're seeing on the recovery. Please note that we will have a Q&A session following the panel. You can ask questions in the Q&A field at the bottom of your screens. Please do hold your questions until the end because it can get a little bit distracting to have questions in the middle of the panel, but we are really eager to address all of your questions, so please do pose them at the end of the session. We will prompt everyone when that session will begin. And please note that Kite Hill is also recording the session and we'll be sharing it afterwards for everyone to tune in. And now I will hand it over to Nicole to lead us through the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gina. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And thank you to my three guests, Lauren, Gabriella, and Amanda. It's great to be here with you all today talking about digital media. I'd love if we could kind of kick things off by talking about the consumer behavior side of things. You know, I'm sure that we've all heard a ton about how much consumer behaviors have changed over the past 8 to 10 weeks. And we've seen some surveys that say things like folks are spending more time online, spending more time watching video, streaming media, but you know, consumer surveys aren't necessarily granular enough to fully understand what's going on out there in the world with consumers. And some of these behaviors may or may not be ad supported. So can you tell us what you've learned about consumer behavior based on maybe seeing impression volume and how some of these things have changed over the past several weeks? Gabriella, maybe you could kick us off there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, you know, mobile data usage as a whole has surged, you know, since the beginning of COVID-19 and the pandemic. You know, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile all reported, you know, upwards of 50%, you know, increase in just gaming data usage alone in the first week. You know, and our business has also seen an organic lift, you know, on mobile as well. In terms of impressions, you know, we saw an impression lift of about 15 to 20% across, you know, our SDK traffic, starting around, you know, mid-March. So what we used to see as normal weekend spikes are now the new norm, you know, 7 days a week. So, you know, it's running the gamut there. As far as, you know, gaming app downloads, you know, we've seen about a 60% increase in the first month of the pandemic. Where we've seen the biggest shift is, you know, when we look at the different gaming categories, you know, casual games, those wide appealing themes and, you know, the simple mechanic gaming, like the Fruit Ninjas that you guys might be familiar with, you know, the board and the card and the word games have seen an increase as high as 20% since the beginning of COVID. You know, so social media and news, while all important channels, can cause a sense of anxiety during a time like this for many, you know, so people are looking to gaming and as an alternative way of entertainment, as a way to escape. So that's kind of what we've been seeing in terms of a shift. So I think now brands and advertisers are going to start thinking about these trends and, you know, how and if they will stick post-pandemic, what the new normal will look like and, you know, how they're going to shift their strategies. But, you know, that's kind of what we've been seeing in terms of impression shifts and spikes on our end.
That makes a lot of sense. Lauren, do you have anything to add about what you've learned recently about consumer behavior?
Sure. And I do want to emphasize a point Gabriella made about some of these behaviors that prior to were mostly seen as weekend behaviors, now becoming the new norm, at least for now. I think it's an important point to emphasize, especially as we do consider the lasting effects of some of these consumption habits and what perhaps life may look like, and gaming and streaming and all of these increased activities might look like after people are then allowed to go out and about and return to kind of the business as usual in terms of the activities they were doing, or some of the content perhaps that they were watching on the weekend in terms of live sporting events that perhaps they can't be watching now. So these are all good things to keep in mind. On the topic of trends we've seen, many of the ones that Gabriella mentioned, and I think the important way to put this in context is to acknowledge that a lot of the trends that we've been talking about as an industry for probably the last 12 to 24 months in terms of media usage, in terms of interest, and certainly in terms of growing as advertising categories, are many of the categories that are benefiting from the pandemic and from consumers being hunkered down at home.
Yeah, so continuing to kind of accelerate a lot of the trends that we've all been watching over the past couple of years. Amanda, anything else that you want to add there?
I think the key from a buy side perspective is not all consumption is necessarily something that we can act on. And so while some of the trends are shifting where consumers are spending their screen time, our ability to take advantage of that from an advertising standpoint might not actually be there. The content or the context of the space is really important right now. So while there's a surge in news sites, there's not necessarily a surge in news site advertising spending. Streaming, obviously, we've seen a huge uptick in that area, but we don't necessarily have the advertisers with the budgets to take advantage of that. So I think some of those surges are creating maybe lackluster advertising experiences due to the fact that there's almost more consumption than the industry is ready or economically able to deliver on right now.
Yeah, that does seem to have been the case based on various things that I've seen, and I'm sure that we'll kind of get into a little bit more of those topics a little bit later. In terms of how consumers are responding to the ads that they are still seeing so far, is the data showing any changes in conversion behaviors or maybe some changes in what kinds of messaging that they're responding to? Gabriella, maybe you could lead us off there as well. And, I don't know if you've seen that change over the past 8+ weeks as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think mobile can almost be viewed as its own ecosystem. Users are engaging more with apps, but also finding that, users are more curious to find new titles to play, as we're seeing these app download surges. Ad formats within gaming are highly effective for developers looking to drive audience growth, rewarded video being, the most receptive. And it's not just app developers who are recognizing the value in that. I think, brands are also, seeing that and want to be associated with that. And as far as messaging, we did do a survey that spoke to consumer sentiments. And we found that, consumers throughout the pandemic have been craving continuity. Only 7% didn't want to hear from brands at all during the pandemic. So that's a huge number that still want to hear from the brands that they know and love and trust and, that they're loyal to. But we also learned, while consumers still want to hear from the brands, they're more responsive to more relevant brand messaging. There's overwhelming majority want to know what brands are doing in response to COVID-19. How are they addressing their changing needs? How are the purchases that they're making and the orders that they're placing helping towards the greater good and helping towards the fight, towards the pandemic? I think that's been something that we've seen been consistent throughout the pandemic and, still holds true today. I think more than ever, it comes down to marketers getting the right messages in the right environments and also just understanding their verticals and how they fit into this kind of temporary new normal, as things start to open up again, what things are going to look like, and, just trying to navigate every step of the way and every phase of this pandemic. So I think, just keeping that human element, I think, is important, across the board.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned kind of every phase of the pandemic, because everything I've heard has really been about change, and that, it's a little bit different every day, every week in terms of what people are doing because of what's happening out in the world. Amanda, anything you want to say about, consumer response to ads or creative messaging?
So I think we've seen an interesting dynamic across our industries that we work with. And so we definitely still see consumers spending in similar, and if not some upticks, due to some of the stimulus packages and different things that are affecting people's bank accounts. And so from a retail standpoint, our retail messaging is really landing right now. And we wonder if that's a phase that we're in while we're kind of like responding to the pandemic in an economic way. But I do think that shift in messaging, like Gabriella talked about, is really important, but also now we're in a phase where you almost don't want to go overboard with it. And I think we're at a burnout phase almost already with how much of that messaging can be seen and at what frequency it's being seen at. So for us, frequency has become one of the most important factors for our campaigns, because if there are less advertisers advertising, the frequency in which our ads are being seen is probably higher than we're used to. And so that fall off rate of the consumer's perception and also just the return on ad spend is falling off far faster because that frequency rate's getting hit sooner. So I think while we are still seeing consumers behave in manners that are surprising and unsurprising, I do think that we might be in a phase where people are getting burnt out with some of the messaging that we've been using, and some of that may be because of the low advertising demand.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I had not heard before. Lauren, did you want to add anything there?
I mean, I think Amanda and Gabriella summed up a lot of it. I will add that while creative is definitely something that plays a role in this, it's important to keep in mind that the dynamics of what is appropriate creative, as Amanda said, are constantly changing. And the reality is a lot of marketers are still struggling to figure out what the strategy is. And I think this is something that we're going to see throughout the pandemic, just this constant feeling like marketers are concerned that their messaging is behind, or they're not perhaps being sensitive, or they're being tone deaf. And it is something that a lot of marketers we hear are leaning on some of their partners, whether that's an agency or the platforms or some of the other media sellers that they're working with, to help them through this, to give them the insights on what's appropriate for the situation, the context, and to be able to move forward from there.
Yep. Super good advice. So let's talk more about what marketers are doing to try to reach people, or what they're maybe not doing as much of. So ad spending was certainly down in March on digital in the US, and early research suggests that it is also down probably by double digits during the second half of March. Google and Facebook both reported significant year-over-year declines that month, but some differing results so far in Q2, with Facebook saying they're flat, Google still declining. We at eMarketer think we're going to see double-digit declines year-over-year in display and search during Q2. So what can you tell us about what you are seeing advertisers do in terms of spending, and what the strategy is, if there is a strategy at this point? Amanda, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I think it is industry specific, or even down to like product specific. But overall, I think March was really the reaction phase. So it was the hurry up and pause. Let's kind of figure out what's going on. Let's come up with our strategy. Let's remessage. Let's refocus. I think companies were understanding the economic impact and trying to predict how long that was going to be sustained for. I think Q2 is going to be a relatively flat, if not down, quarter. And I actually think that Q3 could not see the upswing that I think a lot of people are hoping for. And so what we're trying to do is really live in the now, and it is a little bit of a crystal ball scenario where you don't know when states will open up. Will they remain open? What will social distancing look like in their retail experience? Or in their ability to go to an amusement park or to go to a gym. So that is factoring in. So it is definitely a client by client decision or circumstance. But I do think that we've seen some big wins in April because some people are not necessarily having huge hits. And then we've also seen some continued paused action. I really don't know that anyone has the right prediction on what's going to happen. And so it really is day by day. Some of our advertisers are making decisions on a daily basis, which is a lot of work for the advertising agencies and for the in-house marketing teams. And so while everyone is, potentially still home right now, I think it's actually more work than normal to run a brand in this current pandemic.
Does that match your experience, Lauren?
It does. It definitely does. And I think, acknowledging that in May, we definitely saw the first waves of pausing and catching breath and figuring out strategy. Absolutely, we saw that in our COVID-19 research. What we're seeing now in our latest wave of research is that marketers are expecting to get back in the game in Q3. When we asked US marketers and agencies when they plan to start either reallocating or reinvesting some of those dollars, a good portion of them listed Q3 as the quarter to do that. Many, I think about 20%, also said they are willing to do that in June as well. So in their minds, there's optimism that time is coming. That said, we also asked them whether their budgets would be what they were pre-COVID-19. And for the bulk of marketers, that is not going to be true. So I think that really speaks to some of the trends that we've been talking about with regard to CPMs and pricing and performance, is that even as spend comes back in, it won't necessarily be at the level it once was, depending on how things shake out with social distancing, where we are in terms of some of these big out and about categories like automotive or restaurants or retail being able to open up. Those are big spenders. Those are big spenders who are willing to pay a healthy CPM. So all of that plays a role in what we could potentially see for the rest of the year.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And it really fits in with how I've been kind of thinking about, when's the quote unquote bounce back, with things opening up from a consumer perspective. I think a lot of us are really searching for normalcy right now. So when we hear things like, oh, this chain is talking about opening back up, Starbucks, an example I heard the other day, sounds really reassuring. But when you think about it, it's like, well, they're not going to go back to their previous state of business. They might be opening back up, they might be spending on advertising again, but they're not going to be doing 100% of their year ago business just based on the distancing that will still be needed. So that's part of what you have to keep in mind about the media spending as well. So some of those advertisers that pulled spend in March did so temporarily. They were pausing to kind of rejigger their creative messaging. Maybe if they were in retail or restaurant, it was about curbside pickup and delivery as opposed to their usual come in and shop messaging. Can you talk a little bit about, what the strategy behind those was and whether that spending seemed to kind of come back in April with different messaging? Amanda, maybe you can kick us off again.
Yeah, I think that it was kind of all over the place. Some of our advertisers that paused in March remain paused today, and that depends on the category that they serve. Other advertisers were able to remessage and refocus, and so that was more about how long did they need for that creative cycle to be completed before they could move forward with a new buy. I will say that for the most part, budgets have always been impacted. There's not many situations where the pause happened and then the budget came back at or above what we expected it to come back at. There have been some opportunities in the reality of industries that have flourished, and no one wants to say that you're benefiting from a pandemic, but I think they're benefiting from the social distancing result of the pandemic. And so, where you have takeout ability and you have curbside pickup, you have a really strong e-commerce play, those folks really actually probably needed to move quickly to take advantage of the fact that they were the go-to resource for consumers. And so it really went across the board. And now we're in an interesting place where not every state is in a stay-at-home order anymore. And so geography is playing a big role. So in April, we definitely saw people trickle back in. And we definitely saw search and social really were kind of those fundamental things that didn't necessarily stay paused for very long. But now it's about the sentiment of the advertising and what they're going after. And so we're seeing some resurgence in May, but by no means at the pace that we were seeing spend that we forecasted for.
Yeah. Lauren, how about on your end?
Similar. Again, it depends on the type of business. It depends on what the circumstances are with coming back in or being able to even resume some of that paused activity. Creative was definitely a concern, making sure that you're going back in with the right creative. Also, just whether you were able to continue with your strategy as planned. Do you have products that you can sell? You now can't direct people toward a particular location or physical place to go and buy your product. What do you do? And so an interesting dynamic with some of that is we are seeing advertisers shifting their money and their focus to other parts of the funnel. Okay, we can't drive people into a car dealership right now, but we can make sure that we give them a lot of coverage if they're researching and they're looking for information so that we can fill that part of the funnel. And then when we're ready, come back where we need to go. And I think that's important to keep in mind, when we're talking about pausing and reactivating, sometimes it makes sense to go with where you were and what your strategy is, but in a lot of cases, it requires an entirely new pivot in different channels or utilizing different properties within a specific platform.
Yep. Gabriella, anything you can add about that?
Yeah, I mean, totally agree just in terms of, the shift for new creative messaging in the beginning, certain verticals feeling it differently than others. I think in the beginning, March, early April, we definitely saw the brand side of the house kind of take a dip, but then, our performance and our DR focused spenders, we're actually seeing growth. So I think that's just a good indicator of how the pandemic has progressed and, how marketers are trying to quickly shift their strategies, in response to the current events and, how quickly they can turn things around. I think, that DR app install kind of approach, it was one strategy that some brands took and kind of shifted as kind of a quick response.
Yeah, it's one of these things that seems to be there's simultaneously multiple trends going on. Like you said earlier, Amanda, every vertical, every product category is so different. It's hard to give a blanket thing. We've heard a lot in the past week plus about DR doing really well, especially with app install. But Lauren, as you say, in some categories, it doesn't make sense to do these lower funnel things anymore, but you still might be doing something more in the consideration or awareness stage. It's not a blanket, only DR is happening right now and all brand is pulling back, right?
I think there's also nuance to DR as well, depending on your product and what the benefit is to a consumer. There's a lot of questions about whether now is the right time to push that hard and to sell that hard. And so I think these are all things that impact it one way or another.
Yep. So we've talked about pricing a little bit, at the same time that advertisers were generally pulling back on spending, the supply of impressions across digital channels has gone up because people are spending more time online doing all sorts of activities. So unsurprisingly, we've heard a lot of reports about prices falling, especially back in March, but maybe some signs of stabilization since then. What can you tell me about the pricing changes that you have seen so far? Are there any clear trends? Are we just talking about lots of volatility and no clear trends? Amanda, if you could start us off there, that'd be great.
Yeah, Goodway has been really tracking this closely, and we've actually published a dashboard to highlight kind of what trends we're seeing. And around mid-April to the end of April, we did start to see maybe a leveling off. Potentially, maybe we had started to see behavior in a pricing and win rate standpoint start to level off or maybe hit the bottom in that sense. And then hopefully, in an optimistic view of the data, start to actually climb back towards kind of pre-COVID times. I think CPMs fluctuated a lot and did drop, but I actually think that was more about publishers reacting to the demand that they had and the excess supply, and then trying to redefine their floors and redefine what the pricing strategy really was. So a lot of that fluctuation may have been a lack of advertiser demand, but it also was kind of trying to define the new normal of their pricing strategy. Someone like the New York Times was no longer maybe able to monetize as much of their news, but was now looking to monetize more of their recipes. How do they shift that pricing model when it was probably the exact opposite pre-COVID? And so what we've been seeing is that those trends are changing as the states open. And so as consumer behavior in a state that's opening starts to tick up, we're seeing a nice, correspondence where CPMs are starting to rise with that. So where supply and demand are maybe leveling out a bit. But again, it's extremely volatile. So it is day by day. And I think we can look at it and think we know what it means, but I think we'll look back in a month and have a better perception of what these signals actually meant.
Yeah. Lauren, how about you?
We're hearing similar things. Amanda, I really love the research that Goodway Group is doing with the programmatic. And I think, just looking at some of that bottoming out activity happening in early to mid-April, it definitely dovetails with what we were seeing from a initial pausing activity. So, thinking about how this moves forward, again, from a pricing perspective, it is going to depend regionally. As Amanda said, it's going to depend on the types of categories that can get back in the game. And I think for a while we are going to be looking at a pretty volatile market, especially considering that, again, some of the big spenders and the people who are willing to pay healthy CPMs are the categories that are out right now. So until they're able to come back in, or until they do come back in, it's a question of where will they come back in? Where will they even be playing from a channel perspective to alter their strategy and make up for lost time? And I think all of that is going to have a continued effect on pricing. It's going to be really interesting, I think, especially to look at things like Q4 with the holiday shopping period to see what those trends look like, because they probably will look very different than they have in years past.
Oh, yeah. Gabriella, how about from your perspective on pricing?
Yeah, I think pretty much aligned, with what Amanda and Lauren were saying. From our perspective, I think, more users, more time spent with more supply, and factoring in an uncertain brand market, it's naturally going to drive up the price, of the inventory. So I think that we're seeing, similar things there.
So we've talked about all of this volatility a lot. It's been the answer to several questions, lots of unclear trends going on. So what does it mean in terms of advertisers day to day? Like, for example, are they going to have to put automated bidding strategies on hold? Amanda, let's have you kick us off there as well. What are some of the day-to-day problems of just dealing with this super volatile and reactive market?
So I think it's a great point. I think a lot of the automation that's built into our industry is based on history. I think that applies greatly to search and also programmatic. I don't think it requires you to put some of your automation on hold completely, but I think you need to reassess it. And you need to make sure that the performance is in alignment with what that automatic optimization is actually doing. Our search team started this discussion a few weeks ago about, if everything I learn and know in search is about the history, how does this time frame really change how I look back, what my look back window is, what I take action on, what the Google trends are? And so that, I think, is making our tech departments really reassess. Not only does it work in this pandemic, but post this pandemic, we kind of have this pause in time where consumer behavior and consumer consumption has changed dramatically, and we don't know what the new normal will look like. And so I do think the importance of hands-on keyboard and that human context is extremely important in a time like this. But I don't think it kills automation, holistically.
Yeah. Lauren, anything from you on that?
I think it's an interesting trend, and really to me it speaks to the two sides of programmatic that have been in the industry for a long time. On the one side, you have the set it and forget it folks who really just look at it as an easy way to spend and move toward whatever metrics they need to meet. And those people are in trouble. They're definitely in trouble. And so I think this is now the time where the people who really understand programmatic and can really manipulate things to feed into the algorithms are going to be the people that pull ahead. Amanda noted the importance of constantly reassessing performance, and some of those KPIs may change as a result of this, as a result of limited budgets or just some other dynamics that you have within your business. All of that needs to be accounted for. And the other thing I'll add is that, we're hearing that this isn't something that buyers or agencies are necessarily going alone. We're hearing that they are leaning heavily on partners like Google and the media sellers and any of, Facebook, any of the big platforms where they're spending to really, really understand what are the trends that you can tell me. Okay, if I can't necessarily use the forecasting and history that I've used every month to plan, what can you tell me? How can you better feed me the insights that I need to make the best decisions that I can with the money I have? And so I think that's a trend that's going to continue.
I've heard that with respect to leaning on publishers and platforms. I've also heard that with respect to demand for managed services. That people want help with their strategy and executing it. I think it's been interesting because you might think, a trend like in-housing, which has traditionally been viewed as a cost savings measure, would kind of recessionary effects spur more in-housing. It seems from where I sit, like maybe that'll happen for some people, but not necessarily, because in reality, in-housing is a huge investment, really challenging to do. And people do seem to be, like you said, Lauren, leaning on these partners right now. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything more about that.
Yeah, I could add a little color to that. All in all, I think, it's fundamentally important to be consultants and subject matter experts during a time like this. That's the strategy that we've taken, arming our clients with facts and stats, whatever we could possibly get our hands on, to be better partners and giving clients tools, to navigate and activate on, these unprecedented times. And as an exchange, an SSP, representing over 100,000 app developers, we've seen with the right programmatic infrastructures in place, the opportunity for those publishers to gain access, to that programmatic demand. So yeah, I think, we've just been committed to giving brands and marketers, transparent, brand safe, accountable marketplace, to satisfy their KPIs. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
No, I was just gonna say, I totally agree. And I think while the focus before COVID was, the death of the third-party cookie and how first-party data was going to become so important, I think it just highlights the importance of your own data and then how you marry it with the immediacy of data. And so while a lot of platforms will give you, look back windows that maybe go past the COVID time period, our data science and analytics team have been able to dig in and look specifically at the time that we're working in, with the knowledge that as we come out of it, those strategies will have to be completely rethought. I feel like we re-strategize on a weekly and sometimes daily basis with some of our advertisers because things just don't remain the same. If it's a geography, based regional client, 3 states that are high in their kind of dominance open up, everything changes. If trends in consumption change, everything changes. So the ability to be agile and pivot with data to support that rationale, because you just can't go to an advertiser and say, we've got this gut feeling that you should do this now. I think the data backing up your decisions is more important than ever. And I think COVID will push us forward in that approach to planning.
Well, and along those lines, my next question was whether there have been kind of any new strategic opportunities that you've seen open up for some advertisers, especially since prices are lower on at least some formats, audiences, and devices? You know, I think we've all heard reports about some DR advertisers who can, you know, do maybe an app install campaign that's profitable now that wasn't before. Is there any other examples that any of you can talk about of new opportunities or strategies in this environment? How about you, Lauren?
Yeah, so I think with the pricing being where it is, that does give some brands the opportunity to get in and perhaps get more reach than they previously had in the past when you factor in the pricing and the fact that in some of these environments, there's probably less competition. From a sponsorship perspective, we have heard about brands who in the past have been boxed out by pricing for big homepage takeovers and things of that nature, but now are able to take advantage of that. And I also think, you know, when you think about the creative limitations and how some of the industry, you know, not necessarily even in digital, is pivoting to account for the lack of creative production and the difficulty to create some of those high value brand awareness units, I think this really creates a situation where you have the opportunities to see more unique sponsorships and types of advertising that, you know, can be produced without a standard unit, more native type things and more unique opportunities that should be interesting to see how advertisers work together with partners and publishers to leverage those and take advantage of them.
Yeah, Amanda, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think there have been opportunities where advertisers have actually shifted spend into this quarter because of, you know, I think about some of our retail clients that sell, you know, home appliances, and everyone's stuck at home and you're thinking to yourself like, oh, I need this now, and this is way more important in my life than it was 2 months ago. So I think there's situational opportunities that advertisers have to be ready for. I think one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that we're all working remotely, and Lauren just brought it up in the sense that changes how we can physically do the jobs we were doing. Goodway is a 100% remote company to begin with. And so while we didn't feel the shift, we felt the partners we work with go through that shift. And so that's been really key in understanding like where you can take advantage of pricing opportunities. We also have advertisers who are just not in economic situations right now to take advantage of those pricing opportunities. There are things that they would want to do and that they agree the strategy makes complete sense, but economically they're keeping people in jobs. You know, that's really the bottom line. I have never seen marketing get as close to the economics of the business as I have during this pandemic. And I think that's always important. And I think in those opportunities where people are shifting their marketing focus, they're really seeing what does drive their business and what doesn't. Also, upfronts not happening in the same manner that they've ever happened before, I think are driving opportunities for other advertisers who haven't had those types of relationships or don't spend at that level to come in to places that they weren't able to before because it was already sold and it was already boxed out. So I do think this will change, you know, how we move forward. I think what we thought we'd see over the next 5 years, we're going to see in the next, you know, 12 to 18 months. I think this speeds everything up a lot faster.
Yep. Yeah. Anything you want to add there, Gabriella?
No, I think they covered pretty much everything on that front.
Great. So just to let everyone know, we've got one more question before we get into Q&A. So if you've got some questions saved up, you can start entering those now. So we've talked about opening back up for business. It's started to happen in the US. The national conversation really seemed to turn in that direction a few weeks ago, and it's happening now in some locations. It's not the same everywhere, and it's not happening at the same times everywhere. So I'd love if we could just kind of wrap up by talking about some of the things that advertisers need to consider about how that's all going to work. You know, can you do a national campaign? What can you do? What kinds of messaging are appropriate in those early opening states? And like, what should advertisers be watching as this reopening kind of slowly begins? Amanda, let's do you first.
Yeah, I think the national campaign mindset just isn't possible at this time unless it is a COVID message about how your brand is delivering or answering the call of this pandemic. I think that still exists because even in states that are opening up, that messaging resonates. I do think that we're now working really closely with our advertisers because pockets of their businesses are opening back up, and some of them are opening and some of them aren't. So that's another factor that we're playing into. We have seen where the demand, because everyone has been kind of unable to do certain things, is extremely high right now. So marketers are maybe in a wait and see period because they don't really want to flood the market with an advertising budget until they actually see what is sustainable from a business model. And so it really has been state by state planning, zip code by zip code planning takes a lot of work. And it's not something that you necessarily can shift a national strategy into smoothly. So it's going to take time. So I don't think we're going to see marketers really start to capitalize on states that are opening up for a period of time, because I think it's going to take a lot of work to get ready for that. And then also we're preparing those advertisers for, like, there may be a rebound and we may have to go backwards. And so how do you ensure agility in your plan so that you can walk away from your plan as quickly as you walked into it? Mm-hmm. So I think those are kind of the factors that we're working with. So we're really in strategy phases right now. And those states that opened in the past week or so, I think are starting to see an uptick in ad spend, but I think the marketers are still in response mode.
Yeah. Lauren, how about you guys? What are you seeing there?
I mean, I think Amanda said it so well, and really,
she just keeps doing that.
She does, I know. Yeah, from a national perspective, as she said, unless it is something much more high level, then it's going to be hard to pull off, just given the regional considerations and given the fact that, the reality is the virus will dictate the timeline. And that's what we've seen in our research in terms of marketers looking to things like relaxing of social distancing and finding a vaccine and all of those things to really understand when they can go back in full. Obviously, regionally, you can do that. If you're working in an industry where there's a franchise level or a regional level, certainly that complicates this a bit, but it does create opportunity for some of those franchises and regional outposts to be a little bit more flexible and get back in the game. Where it complicates things, though, is how does that roll back up to the national message? How do they reinforce each other? And I think that's something that is really difficult to do in this environment. Also, from a national perspective, we're still in a situation with television right now where there are a lot of those big opportunities like the live sporting events that are dark. And, if we're looking at a situation perhaps in the fall where we don't have some of these shows running because they haven't been in production, that also has an effect on some of the national campaigns that advertisers may or may not be hoping to run.
Yep. Gabriella, anything else from your perspective on, these considerations as states start opening up?
Yeah, I think this whole pandemic has been like a marathon, right? I think it feels like, it might still feel early to kind of predict how things are going to play out, but we hope to get closer every day. I think there'll be some winners and some losers, but, it's an inflection point in the advertising market, an opportunity for publishers, marketers, and everybody in between to kind of rethink value and opportunity and strategy and tactics, realizing that the situation is going to be fluid and will likely be for quite some time. So, consumer messaging is no longer a one size fits all, but we'll have to be bespoke for, certain audiences and channels. And I think businesses have already started to think about what their new normal is going to look like, how to take advantage of being more remote, and innovating to expand and adapt. So, you know, the changes that they're making now to their strategies may also change their target markets or their market approach. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. As much as we all wish we had that crystal ball, all we can do is, you know, use data to make, you know, new strategies. So.
Yeah. You know, on this same question, one thing that none of you really talked about, and I'm super curious to hear what you think, because I've gotten questions about it as well. Like, how worried do you think that brands should be about sensitivity in messaging, you know, now, especially as we're opening up and it feels like the consumer situation is so polarized, you know, politically by the response and, you know, questions about when are we going to open up, what are we going to do? Is that something that you think the typical advertiser should be worrying about? Like, will half my audience feel one way and half's going to feel the opposite way about what's going on right now? Lauren, I see you nodding. I'm calling on you.
I do think it's something that they need to be thinking about. And I think this just speaks to some of the confusion that we're seeing about the appropriate path to take with creative. You know, we hear from brands questions like, when do I know that it's okay to then, you know, to turn it back on and try and use my messaging for a little bit more of a hard sell? You know, when can we move past some of the sensitivities and empathy to start to try and use creative again that's business as usual? And as you pointed out, Nicole, it's a really hard question. I think it's an even harder question for some of these brands that are in industries that are opening back up, right? If you're a QSR, if you're retail, you know, what does that messaging look like? If you're driving people to your store, you have to be aware that there still are concerns, health concerns about going back into some of these public places. And I think it just creates a really difficult environment for brands to move forward with one clear path on what that strategy and messaging should be.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's not just the messaging, right? It's the actual policy. You know, if you are talking about your physical establishment and you're bringing customers back in, there's the genuine issue of what are you doing? That's part of your brand also, but that's not necessarily what a media buyer can control.
Right.
Challenging there. Awesome. Well, sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
No, I was just going to say that I think it comes down to there's purpose-driven advertising, and then there's what you're delivering, what your value proposition is that you're delivering to a consumer. And I think both of them are impacted by this time. I obviously think an industry that's impacted by physical locations has an even tighter tightrope to walk. But for our retail clients, it's really about, does the value proposition of your client match the time that we're in? And is that going to resonate? And regionally, I think that does play into the decision making. I definitely think that there is no, like, you know, windfall moment when a state opens. I think it just opens a whole new discussion point of concerns for marketers and brands. And so the same creative remessaging that we went through at the beginning of COVID, or the beginning of our reaction to COVID, I think will happen as we reopen, and hopefully we won't have to reclose. So I think the stress on brands right now is immense, but economically they have to respond. And so sitting out isn't necessarily the option, even though the path forward is extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to end the main part of our discussion. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. And you, Lauren, and Gabriella as well. Moving on to the Q&A, we've got a handful of good questions in here. Let's start with, you know, we mentioned earlier that there were a lot of trends that have been ongoing for the past year or two that are accelerating now in this time. But let's talk about what those questions actually are, or what, you know, what's accelerating. So one thing would be like a shift to online grocery shopping. But let's go through some others. Lauren, do you want to get started on that? What are some of the consumer trends that you're seeing happen faster than we expected?
Sure. I think another one that Gabriella mentioned is the shift to gaming. That is certainly one that we've been talking about for a long time. And, you know, from an advertising perspective, we know that that's always been a big category of advertisers, but I think this is the inflection point where it just gets that much bigger. Another behavior is obviously streaming and cord, not necessarily even in this instance cord cutting or cord shaving, but just the shifting to more digital video, more over the top, more connected TV. That is absolutely something we're seeing with the pandemic as consumers are stuck in their houses and looking for ways to entertain themselves. It's a shift we've been talking about for 24 to 36 months, especially on the programmatic front. You know, when's connected TV going to grow up? When's it going to be ready? And, you know, this is really, again, just putting that timeline in compression mode. Audio is another one, digital audio. It's a little bit of an interesting one, though, when you look at the pandemic, because depending on the type of audio, you know, you may see either an acceleration or a bit of a contraction. A lot
if
of
it was something you were doing commuting, you're not doing it anymore.
Right.
Yep.
So but nonetheless, if you look at the category as a whole, that also seems to be up. You mentioned e-commerce. Certainly that's one that we've seen the acceleration, and this has just exploded from that perspective. Gabriella, Amanda, what else am I missing here?
I think you covered most of them. You know, obviously from our perspective, we've been seeing gaming, you know, as a trend, and I think, you know, this COVID shift just kind of accelerated that, and, you know, it kind of almost proved out, you know, and drawn attention to how valuable, you know, the mobile gaming audience can really be, and kind of debunk the stereotype around who the mobile gamer is. So we've definitely seen that kind of accelerate things for us on our end, luckily.
Yeah, we all finally believe that it's not just a certain demographic that is gaming, even though you guys have been telling us forever that it was everyone. I do feel one area that's shifting is obviously the direct to consumer. So we have this like explosion of direct to consumer brands. But the reality is that a lot of like brick and mortar based businesses are now, you know, they were in the middle of slowly shifting, but then now they're in the hurry up and catch up. And I do think while, you know, mergers and acquisitions have slowed down, I do think we potentially see some big retail players who have the ability to acquire a D2C brand that can bring them that delivery and that agility, and that approach from a digital element happens. And I don't know that that would have happened as quickly if we didn't have this pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. I'll also just mention a decelerating trend, or even a reversal in trend that we've seen and is part of our new time spent with media forecast at eMarketer. We're seeing an increase in time spent with linear TV. We don't expect that to last forever, but we are seeing it for this year. So, you know, certain trends maybe have been stopped or reversed a little bit as a result of what's going on as well. Another question from the audience, can you talk a little bit about the impact for publishers? I think probably been pretty negative since it's involved a pullback in ad spending. You know, we have seen earnings results from a few major digital ad sellers that had a little bit of a better time. Gabriella, do you want to get us started off there?
Yeah, sure. You know, for publishers, from, you know, our perspective, we have seen, you know, more users, more time spent. So I think it's actually benefited our, you know, our gaming publishers. You know, we're getting more demand, you know, especially from, like I said, the DR side of the house as well. So yeah, I think that's what we've been seeing.
Anything, Lauren or Amanda, you want to add on the publisher side?
I mean, as a buyer, I sit in an influencing, but I don't sit in their seat, but I have worked on the publisher side in the past. And I think one of the biggest frustrations a publisher has is when they have the supply and they have the audience and they can't monetize it. And I think when it comes to the COVID-19 related news, it is what everyone is consuming. And there is a way to safely advertise in it. It is more complicated and it takes a very strategic approach. But to Lauren's earlier point, if you're a set it and forget it marketer, you should steer clear of a COVID-19 situation. But if you're an agile, data-driven marketer, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And publishers are really hoping that the buy side sees that and starts to capitalize on it. But it was one of my largest frustrations as a publisher, is when we would have a humongous news event and we could only monetize, 25% of that audience. And that's how they continue bringing you that content, is by monetizing it.
Yeah. So looking at kind of the broader landscape, more on the advertiser side, to what extent do we see digital marketing companies really suffering in this environment, being forced to downsize because of the pandemic? We've seen some of the major holding companies announce that people were taking pay cuts, but we've also talked just now about the fact that a lot of managed services are getting more demand. Any thoughts kind of on, whether this nets out in any clear way? Amanda?
Yeah, I think ultimately, if you were strong going into the pandemic, you will be stronger coming out of it. And if you were at a weaker point, you could potentially be weaker or not come out of it. I think digital marketing companies have had a large strain, and some of that is because their models were paid off of media spend. And so obviously, if media spend stops, revenue generation stops, but the bills don't stop from the previous month. So I think it's the cash on hand, it's the security of that company. And I don't know that as we picked partners in the past, we looked, not us, but I think as an industry, we didn't necessarily look at, how strong of a business they truly were to weather a storm. But I think that will start to come into play coming out of COVID-19. I think there are a lot of opportunities for strong companies, but I do think we are going to see a lot of changes across all of ad tech, where the strong players or the necessary players just unfortunately don't make it through this pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I have talked to some people who have suggested that they have been maybe trying to protect themselves since a little bit earlier, since the Seismic bankruptcy. So we'll see, I guess, whether people were maybe ready for some of these stress tests. Lauren, I don't know if you want to add anything there, or Gabriella. Nope. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about getting toward the end of the year. I know we definitely have a crystal ball to see what the holiday season will be like, right? So what can advertisers do to prepare for that situation? Lauren?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think the reality is it's just too far in advance to plan for at this point. We did ask in our research about back to school, which is sooner than the holiday. And 60% of our advertisers said it was too soon to tell what that plan or strategy would look like. And really, we're seeing people keep to sort of this 3-month window of where they're able to kind of project and strategize to at this point in time. And I think the holiday, unfortunately, just has too many wild cards ahead of it for people to make any sort of significant plans or predictions about what that will look like.
Mm-hmm. Anything anyone wants to add there?
Yeah, I was just gonna totally agree with Lauren in the sense that the window of planning has really shrunk. And so if you had a brand who was annually planning, they're at a minimum quarterly planning now, if not monthly planning. And so while budgets still remain on the table, the reality of those budgets are in a wait and see holding pattern. I think about the holidays, I think about the election, I think about the fear of a recession. There's so many things at play outside of the pandemic as you think further down the line. I really think as I read through like economic reports that this is the 2020 scenario into 2021. And so I think we're going to be in a short-term decision-making process for at least the remainder of 2020.
Yeah. I do want to get in one final question here because I think it's a really good one, and it goes to something that Lauren said earlier. Do consumers really want to be sold to right now, even from their trusted brands? I'd love any just kind of final thoughts on, that consumer mindset and what you're kind of feeling receptive to hear, even from a marketer that you really like. Lauren, why don't you go first?
If you're providing value, then I say yes. If there's a reason that somebody would be looking for your product or service and it's valuable to them, then there's no reason to back off from that. Again, you might have to alter the way that you go about that, but this isn't the time for brands that could be providing a service to consumers to assume that they don't want that message. It's just about doing it in a way that is appropriate.
Amanda?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think if you have a value proposition that still exists in this pandemic, which most brands do have, I don't see there not being an opportunity. And those who have advertised through, I think we could only compare this to a recession or through a traumatic event in that regard. And brands who have spent through those opportunities, if they're able to, have always come out stronger on the other side.
Yeah. Gabriella, you want to agree, disagree, add anything there?
Totally agree with all of that. I think that it's still important to be sensitive around the messaging, but people want to hear from brands still, especially if the value prop is there. So totally agree with everything Lauren and Amanda.
We want that normalcy, right?
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Gina, let's turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much to everybody for joining us, to our panelists, to Nicole for moderating, and to our sponsor, AdColony. Thank you so much for joining us today. What a great conversation, really important topics that we covered. We will be following up with everyone, sending around the video so everyone can tune in later and help to spread all these important points. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.